I'm a huge fan of the Star Trek series, and I consider Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager to be the peak of the series. There was a certain way they told stories, particularly in the Next Generation, that was a product of the times, and later editions of the series moved away from that. Less action and violence, more solving issues with science and diplomacy. There was a certain slowness to the storytelling, taking their time to showcase the mundane activities on board of a starship that the movies and the later shows did away with. Next Generation could have half an episode dedicated to why the warp core is not functioning properly and needs diagnostics. Or an entire multi-episode arc set in a room where they're negotiating a peace treaty with an alien race. Compared to modern Star Trek, where the stories are dumbed down and quickly paced to get to the action, the older series took its time and immersed you in a futuristic world. They were proud of what they had created. Fans of the older shows could practically walk you through the Enterprise D, the USS Defiant, or even the USS Voyager. Released on the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, and PC through the Epic Games Store that had an exclusive contract with it for a first year, and now Steam, Star Trek Resurgence is the first piece of Star Trek media in decades that actually goes back to that old form of storytelling. The game is willing to take its time and have you work on a starship, investigate why the warp core is having problems, use science to solve those issues, and talk to hostile aliens instead of pulling out your phasers and shooting everything in sight.
Heading locked. Raise shields.
This is it!
All hands, brace for impact.
Star Trek Resurgence is set shortly after the end of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, and most of those movies. The war with the Dominion is over, the Romulans are in peace talks with the Federation, and the cast of the Next Generation has mostly moved on to new pursuits. Star Trek Resurgence takes place on board the USS Resolute, a science and exploration vessel that had recently been in a very serious accident that left it practically snapped in half and killed some of the crew, including the original first officer. While they were running tests on the warp core, the captain pushed it too far and it malfunctioned. There was a lot of animosity going around amongst the crew towards their captain, Solano, who was looking to solidify his legacy at the tail end of his career, and he's worried that any more problems are going to see him stripped of his command by Starfleet. So you have Jera Rydick, a Kobolad who is coming aboard the Resolute as its first officer. Rather than promote somebody from within, Captain Solano, who is absolutely paranoid of people betraying him, not following orders, or pushing back against his commands, has brought her in from the outside of the ship because they worked together in the past, and he trusts that, since she's an outsider, she's going to back him up because she has no other relationships with anyone else on the crew. Koboliods are rare, and outside of a few episodes in the series, they aren't a major player in the Star Trek universe. Basically, they're this dying race. They need regular infusions of duridium, or their cells are going to destabilize and they're going to die. How Jera reacts to situations is up to the player, with her either following Solano's every order or getting along better with the rest of the crew. She's the first playable character and represents the upper decks, or the command portion of the starship. Then we have Carter Diaz, who's an enlisted petty officer who works in engineering. Rather than a Starfleet officer, he's one of the grunts that does the dirty work around the ship. He offers a lower decks perspective, which really is like the daily activities and running a starship. He was on the Resolute during the malfunction that crippled it, and so he has a lot of experience on working on the ship. Where Jara gives you insight into the missions and the goals of Starfleet and the Federation and all that high level stuff, Carter Diaz lets you pick up a tricorder and investigate the problems with the warp core or the nacelles or other problems on the Resolute. It's all the nerdy stuff that the Next Generation would showcase, and that fell aside for the action in the later series. I absolutely loved it.
Computer, give me manual control on the warp power.
density, warp 1.1. 1.2. 3. Warp pressure is destabilizing. Error in warp field calculation. The warp drive has experienced a system-wide cascade failure. Warp field collapsed.
So that's the setting. You have a new first officer and a bunch of crew on a ship, which has its fair share of interpersonal problems, along with problems with the starship, and a captain terrified of failing again. Their mission is to go to the Hotari system, where two races are having a conflict over mining rights on one of the moons. The Hotari are a more primitive race, and they're used as manual labor in these mines that are in their system. Because of the fact they didn't have the technology to open and operate these mines in the first place, the Elydians gave them the technology and funding in return for the Hotari doing the actual work. It's like how in our world we have these remote, hard-to-develop places like, for example, Alaska, or maybe the Arctic, and they had these oil reserves. So investors provide the funding and equipment to get those resources, but the people there in those areas do most of the work, while the investors reap most of the profits. It's imbalanced, and over the centuries, the Hotari can't get out from under the Elydians since there's such a difference in military power. But recently, the Hotari shoved the Elydians out of these mines and seized them for themselves. The Federation has been asked to mediate this because they're a neutral party and they're outside of Federation space. Their neutrality is questionable though, because the Elydians provide the Federation with a lot of the dilithium crystals that they need. It pretty much fuels Starfleet's ships. Enter the first two of Star Trek Resurgence's big cameos. Ambassador Spock comes on board the Resolute and will be leading the negotiations. Straight off the bat, the voice actor for Spock does a fantastic job. I honestly couldn't tell it wasn't Leonard Nimoy anymore. It was just perfect.
Terra firma, so to speak.
Ambassador Spock!
Throwing a wrench into everything is an ion storm that is preventing warp from working and damaging their systems. Spock and the Resolute suspect the Hotari are using this storm to their advantage to remove the Elydians from controlling the mines. During the investigation, Jara Rydick discovers that the Hotari have found a piece of Takan technology. Who are the Takan? You're probably not going to remember them since they only came up directly in a single episode of The Next Generation towards the beginning of the series, and a few odd mention of them in other episodes. They're this advanced civilization from over 600,000 years ago that once ruled the galaxy before they died off. Portal 6-3 was encountered by the Enterprise D, and Riker negotiated with them to let the Enterprise go. Which brings us to our second cameo. William T. Riker makes an appearance, and he's pretty good. They use him just enough to make him important, but they don't rely on him so much that he takes over the story. They struck a really good balance. That's the setup for the story, and I don't want to spoil very much since it is engaging, immersive, and filled with twists and turns. It feels like one of those memorable 3-part episodes of The Next Generation that takes its time to set things up and it doesn't rely on the action to keep things interesting. Like I said at the start of this review, it's the first piece of Star Trek media in decades that felt like an actual part of the old Star Trek that I loved.
But it is unlikely the relatively primitive Hotari forces would stand a chance against the Elydian fleet if this escalates to open war. Left unchecked, this conflict will result in more bloodshed, which is what we are here to prevent.
And the dilithium trade hangs in the balance.
For gameplay, Star Trek Resurgence plays like a Telltale game. That isn't a surprise since it's made by former Telltale devs. It's like a visual novel with a lot of character interactions, answering or asking questions when directed. Your choices in dialogue and during this story affects things throughout the game. How you treat characters around you, both allies and enemies, gives them a different opinion of you. Since this is a game where characters' attitudes and emotions towards both Carter and Jara are so important, it does mean that a lot of what they do and how they act doesn't really mesh too well with the Star Trek universe at times. People in this game are pretty prone to being petty or have outbursts or emotional decisions than you would really expect from a Starfleet officer. What I mean is, in the old Star Trek, it was made pretty clear that humanity has evolved into more altruistic and unselfish people than they used to be. They want to work for a common goal, they respect life and each other, and are more willing to protect others, including their enemies. You saw this on how they treated the Dominion after the war, or the Cardassians, or even the Romulans. But in Star Trek Resurgence, people are much more petty than that. They will judge you if you give a promotion to one person over another, or you don't destroy innocent aliens just because some other of that race are attacking you. This is because of the gameplay mechanics. How there are levels of affection and respect that will affect the storyline and the endings. Sure, it doesn't totally fit to the Star Trek universe set in Next Generation, for example, but it's never bad enough to detract from the game. Just be aware that you aren't dealing with androids like Data, whose opinion of you probably won't change. These people will care if you call them out on something or choose the more logical choice. Aside from the dialogue and relationships between characters, there are a slew of mini-games in Resurgence. You have scanning objects with a tricorder, firing your phasers at enemies while you're in cover, using the ship's terminals and computer to plot courses and change teleporter pathways. There are a lot of these minigames, and just like a lot of other minigames in other games, these can really be hit or miss. Some are straightforward, like shooting enemies, while others can be confusing or really simple, like matching the symbols on a computer screen, for example. Then there are those stealth sections, which are absolutely terrible. These stealth sections allow you to lower the difficulty if you hate them, although I got through them just fine on the standard difficulty. Your enjoyment of these minigames will vary, but they are all short enough that if you hate one, don't worry about it too much. It's likely you won't have to do something like that again.
Help isn't just gonna pop over like we're in Sector 001.
Wouldn't hurt to try.
You talk like you've never had your backs up against a wall before. This is Starfleet. We solve our own problems.
Moving on to the graphics and technicals, Resurgence does not look good. It uses the Unreal Engine, which should be able to pump out a lot of good visuals, but it's clear the developers weren't interested in putting a lot of their efforts into the graphics. The best thing I can say about it is that it looks a lot like Mass Effect 1 on the Xbox 360. The facial animations are super simple, only really their mouths and their eyebrows of characters move very much. They stand really stiffly, with their arms out in front of their bodies when they move, like weirdly. Skyboxes are low-quality JPEGs stretched to the extreme, and some of the textures don't fit together properly, leaving gaps in walls or objects. I noticed even a character's arm had a line where the arm and the torso fit together. Hair doesn't move, and it's not really rendered correctly. Overall, Star Trek Resurgence isn't a looker, but what it does have is a faithful recreation of the old style of Starfleet ship. The Resolute has similar panels and carpeted floors as the old Enterprise D from Next Generation. The bridge has these brown leather chairs and there's wood paneling on the panels. Everything looks like a Cadillac from the 80s or 90s with these big cushions, wood panels, carpeted interior, because that was what was luxury at the time period. It's not the cold metal and holographic screens of, say, Picard or Discovery. This is old-fashioned push buttons. Technically, Resurgence is fine. There are some audio glitches with the dialogue, and the subtitles often didn't match what the characters had said. It was as if the voice actor changed the dialogue slightly while they were delivering the lines so that it sounded more natural, while the subtitles were written from the original script. It's a small thing, but something I noticed happened quite frequently, especially if the dialogue cuts off suddenly or the background music drowns out the voice you're listening to, and you're going to have to rely on those subtitles to find out what's happening. But thankfully there weren't any crashes or FPS drops. Alright, let's head to the pros and cons of Star Trek Resurgence. For the pros, with multiple different choices and decisions, you can replay this game again to see how you would have changed the outcome. The game is only 10 hours, which is a good length for the story. There's a lot of Easter eggs, references to different Star Trek properties, and there's recreations of the ships and the equipment that's just fantastic and really faithful to the next generation. The decisions you made throughout the game did feel like it impacted the story, rather than just being surface level. Some of the minigames were very entertaining, but the story was the best part, and I really enjoyed it. Now for the cons, for around $30, it can be a bit pricey for the quality of this game and its length. The graphics are very poor, and there is a few technical glitches with the audio. If you aren't a fan of Star Trek, this probably won't appeal to you. Some of the minigames are downright awful, especially the stealth missions. And that's it for another review. I really enjoyed my time with Resurgence, but that's probably because I forgot how great the next generation was, and how far the new Star Trek series have moved away from that. Thanks for watching, and I hope you leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all in the next review, where we're going to discuss Lord of the Rings: Return to Moria.